The little black girl knocked on the biker's cabin door, saying her stepfather met a stranger in the woods. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into this powerful story. It was a quiet evening in the small, secluded town of Riverton. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the winding roads and dense woods that surrounded the area. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into the bones. Inside a small, worn-down cabin on the outskirts of town, a group of bikers were gathered, sipping their drinks and chatting after a long day of community work. The Iron Riders, known for their reputation as rough men with soft hearts, were enjoying their evening. But little did they know, their lives were about to change. The sound of running footsteps echoed from the distance, growing louder by the second. The door to the cabin slammed open, and in rushed a small figure, a little black girl, no more than 10 years old. Her braids were tangled, her dress torn at the hem, and her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her wide, terrified eyes locked onto the group of bikers, and without hesitation, she ran straight toward them, her small hands grabbing at the nearest biker's leather vest. "Please, you have to help me," she cried, her voice shaking with fear. "My stepfather, he met a stranger in the woods, and they're coming for me." The room fell silent. The bikers exchanged confused glances, unsure of what to make of the frantic little girl standing before them. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his face, stepped forward. His name was Hawk. He had seen his fair share of trouble in his life, but nothing had prepared him for the fear in this child's eyes. "What do you mean?" Hawk asked, his voice calm but firm. "Who is he? What happened?" The little girl gasped for air, her small body trembling with each breath. "My stepfather, he's been hurting my mom, and I tried to stop him, but then he met someone in the woods. A man, a stranger, and now they're both coming for me." The words hit the bikers like a slap to the face. They were no strangers to violence and danger, but hearing about a little girl being threatened like this struck something deep inside them. Without a word, Hawk's crew sprang into action. "Get the bikes ready," he barked. "We're going to find this man and make sure this little girl is safe." As they prepared to leave, the little girl clung to Hawk's arm, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she whispered, "I don't want to go back there." Hawk crouched down to her level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he promised. "We're not letting anything happen to you. You'll be with us until we make sure your mom is okay." The sound of engines roared to life outside, and the Iron Riders revved their bikes, ready to face whatever threat lay ahead. The little girl, still holding on to Hawk's arm, watched as the bikers formed a tight circle, prepared to ride out into the night. The woods were dark and dangerous, but nothing could stop them now. As the bikers revved their engines, heading toward the woods where the little girl's stepfather and the mysterious stranger awaited, Hawk's mind raced. What had they gotten themselves into? What were they about to face in those woods? The answers were unclear, but one thing was certain. They weren't going to let this little girl face it alone. The Iron Riders were a family, and they always protected their own, no matter the cost. The bikers roared down the empty highway, the sound of their engines cutting through the stillness of the night like thunder. Hawk led the group, his eyes narrowed with determination. Behind him, the rest of the Iron Riders followed, their powerful motorcycles lined up in perfect formation. The little girl clung to Hawk's jacket, her small hands trembling. She was scared, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes now that she was with them. Her nightmare, at least for the moment, was over. As they approached the woods, the trees loomed like dark sentinels, casting long shadows under the pale moonlight. The roads grew narrower, more twisted. Hawk's heart raced as he thought about the girl's story. The fact that her stepfather, a man she had feared for so long, was involved with someone dangerous in these woods sent a chill down his spine. What had they gotten themselves into? He couldn't afford to waste any time thinking about it. Every second mattered. "We're close," Bear called out from behind, his voice steady. "Keep your eyes open." Hawk nodded, his grip tightening on the handlebars. He could feel the weight of the girl's fear pressing on him, but he had a job to do. They had to find her mother, and they had to do it before her stepfather and the stranger could hurt anyone else. As they entered the forest, the air grew thick with tension. The distant rustling of leaves echoed in the silence, and the only sound was the steady thrum of their engines. Hawk signaled for the group to slow down. The woods were dense, and they needed to be careful. They couldn't afford to give the stepfather and the stranger an easy escape. They had to find them before they even knew the bikers were there. The girl, still holding onto Hawk's jacket, looked up at him. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there too, a flicker of trust. "Are we going to find my mom?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk knelt down, his face softening. "We're going to find her," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "And we're going to keep you safe." As he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they could have imagined. The girl's stepfather wasn't just some angry man. He was someone with power, someone who had managed to keep his dark side hidden for far too long. Hawk couldn't let that stand. He couldn't let anyone hurt this little girl, and he wasn't going to let her mother be taken from her either. The group moved deeper into the woods, their headlights cutting through the thick trees. Every now and then, they would catch a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, but it was always just out of reach. Hawk's mind raced. The stepfather had brought a stranger into these woods, but why? What had they been planning? As they pressed on, the silence grew heavier. Then, out of nowhere, a flash of movement caught Hawk's eye. A figure emerged from the trees, moving quickly toward them. Hawk's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively pulled his bike to a stop. The rest of the group followed suit. The figure came into view, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap. His face was obscured by the shadows, but Hawk could feel the danger radiating off him. The man stopped about 20 feet away, his eyes scanning the group. For a moment, no one moved. The tension in the air was palpable. Hawk's hand instinctively reached for the handle of his gun, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. He wasn't sure if the man was friend or foe, but he couldn't take any chances. "Who are you?" Hawk called out, his voice firm but steady. The man didn't respond at first. Instead, he took a step back, glancing toward the trees as if looking for something or someone. Hawk's heart sank. Where is he? He thought. The stepfather. The man who had hurt the little girl and her mother. Was he out here somewhere hiding? Hawk had no choice but to act. "Stay here," he ordered the group, his voice low and commanding. "I'm going to talk to him." Slowly, Hawk dismounted his bike and approached the stranger, keeping his distance but watching closely. The man's eyes flicked back to Hawk, then to the girl, who was still holding onto Hawk's jacket. A cold smile curled on his lips. Hawk's instincts flared. He knew that smile. It was a smile of a predator, someone who saw weakness and sought to exploit it. The stranger took another step back, eyes narrowing as if deciding whether to make a move. "You're in the wrong place," Hawk said, his voice hardening. "And you're not welcome here." The stranger didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the dark. Hawk stood there for a moment, watching the shadows swallow him up. "What the hell was that?" Vince muttered, his voice full of tension. Hawk didn't answer. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. The woods were hiding something darker, and he wasn't about to let it stay hidden for long. With a nod to the rest of the bikers, he signaled them to follow. "Let's go," he said. "We're not leaving until we find her mother." The night was heavy with tension as Hawk and the Iron Riders rode deeper into the woods, their headlights slicing through the thick darkness. The figure they had seen earlier had vanished, but Hawk knew that the situation was far from over. Something about the stranger's presence, the cold smile he had flashed, told Hawk that they were not just dealing with a runaway father and a frightened little girl. There was something far darker at play, and they were now in the thick of it. Hawk's mind raced as they pressed on, the rustling of the trees and the occasional snap of a twig under their tires the only sounds breaking the eerie silence. He glanced over his shoulder at the little girl, still clinging to him. Her fear was palpable, but there was also a spark of determination in her eyes. She wanted her mother, and no matter how dangerous this was, she was not going to give up. Hawk could feel that same fire in himself. He had made a promise to her father, and he wasn't about to break it. They had to find her mother. It was the only thing that mattered now. As they approached a clearing, the sound of running water reached their ears, a small creek cutting through the forest. Hawk slowed his bike, signaling the rest of the group to do the same. They were getting closer. The woods were dense, the trees closing in on them like an impenetrable wall. Hawk knew they couldn't afford to keep riding aimlessly. They needed to move carefully. "Stay sharp," he called over the radio, his voice low and urgent. "We're not alone out here." The group nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. They weren't just looking for a man and his stepdaughter anymore. The stranger they had encountered was likely part of something much bigger. Hawk could feel it in his gut. As the bikers spread out, scanning the area for any signs of movement, Hawk took a deep breath and tried to clear his mind. He needed to focus. The little girl had told them everything she knew, but it wasn't enough. Where had her mother gone? Why had the stepfather brought a stranger into the woods? What was the connection between them? Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound nearby. He immediately raised his hand, signaling the group to stop. The Iron Riders fell into a tense silence as they listened. Then, a voice broke through the quiet. "It's him," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. Hawk turned to look at her. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else too, recognition. "Who?" Hawk asked softly. "My stepfather," she whispered again. "He's here." Hawk's pulse quickened. The time for subtlety was over. He motioned for the bikers to advance, and they moved in unison, spreading out in a controlled formation. They were close now. The sound of a low murmur reached Hawk's ears, and he knew they were about to confront whatever danger had been lurking in these woods. As they approached the source of the sound, Hawk's heart pounded in his chest. There, ahead of them, stood a cabin, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. The front door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. Hawk motioned for the group to halt. They had reached the heart of it. He could see the outline of a man standing in the doorway, his posture rigid, almost as if he was waiting for them. "Stay behind me," Hawk ordered the little girl, who nodded and gripped his jacket even tighter. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. As he approached the door, the man inside finally spoke. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice cold and calculating. "You've made a mistake, but I can fix that." Hawk froze, every muscle in his body tense. The man's words hung in the air like a threat. "You don't get to make decisions anymore," Hawk replied, his voice steady, though the anger was bubbling just beneath the surface. "Step aside." The man's cold laughter echoed in the night. "You think you're in control? You're in my territory now." Hawk's hand went to his holster, but before he could make a move, the door swung wide open. Standing in the doorway was not just the stepfather, but the stranger too. The man from the woods. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark, menacing presence. His eyes narrowed as he sized up the bikers, clearly unfazed by the confrontation. Hawk's stomach churned. This was bigger than a simple domestic dispute. This was something more dangerous. "I'm giving you one chance," Hawk said, his voice low but firm. "Let the girl's mother go. Now." The stranger smirked, stepping forward. "You're too late. She's already gone." Hawk's heart sank. He didn't have time to think. The moment the man stepped forward, Hawk moved in. A fight was inevitable. The tension in the air was suffocating. Hawk stood at the threshold of the cabin, staring down the stepfather and the stranger who had emerged from the shadows. The words, "she's already gone," echoed in his mind, twisting into something darker. His heart raced, the adrenaline from the pursuit of the last few hours now a steady drumbeat in his veins. He knew that if they didn't act quickly, they might lose her mother forever. The stranger took a step forward, his broad frame blocking the light from inside the cabin. His eyes were cold, calculating, and the smile on his face only deepened Hawk's unease. "You've made a grave mistake, biker," the stranger said, his voice low and threatening. "This doesn't concern you. Leave now, and you'll be safe. Stay, and I promise you'll regret it." Hawk's grip tightened on the handle of his bike, but his focus never wavered from the man in front of him. "I'm not leaving without the girl's mother," Hawk said, his voice steady but firm. The stranger's smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," he sneered. "This is much bigger than you or her. You think you can just waltz in and play hero." Without warning, the stepfather lunged forward, his hand reaching for the gun tucked into his belt. The bikers didn't hesitate. A single, coordinated move sent them into action. Hawk was already halfway toward the stepfather before the man could pull his weapon, his fist connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening thud. The stepfather stumbled back, crashing into the doorframe, his hand still clutching at the gun but unable to raise it. "I told you not to move," Hawk growled, his voice a warning. The stranger moved to react, but before he could make a move, Bear was there, his massive form stepping in front of the group. His eyes were cold, his expression unwavering. "This is your last chance to walk away," Bear warned. The stranger hesitated, his eyes darting between Hawk and the rest of the bikers. "You think I'm scared of you?" The stranger spat, his hand dropping to his side where a knife glinted under the dim light. Hawk didn't wait for another word. He moved in again, this time with calculated precision. The stranger wasn't fast enough. Hawk grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently until the knife fell to the ground with a clatter. "Enough," Hawk said, his voice now ice cold. He pushed the stranger back, sending him sprawling onto the ground. The stranger scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild with rage. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he hissed. "You're out of your depth." The stepfather, still recovering from the punch, staggered to his feet. He glared at Hawk with fury burning in his eyes. "You think you can stop me? I'll have you arrested. All of you." Hawk didn't flinch. "You'll be arrested all right, but not by the cops," he said, his voice a low threat. "You're done here." The group of bikers closed in around the two men, their presence overwhelming. Hawk could see the fear now in the stepfather's eyes. For the first time, the man looked uncertain. But there was still something deep in his eyes, something that said this wasn't over. Hawk knew that their fight wasn't just physical. It was a battle for control, for safety, and for justice. And it wasn't going to end here. "Where is she?" Hawk demanded again, his voice sharp. The stranger and the stepfather exchanged a brief, tense glance. Finally, the stepfather let out a deep breath. "She's in the back room," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. "Move," he barked, and the bikers quickly moved into position, clearing a path through the cabin. Hawk led the way, his boots heavy on the creaking wooden floor. The little girl followed closely behind him, her hands clutching his jacket. "It's going to be okay," Hawk said, his voice softer now, trying to reassure her. "We're going to get your mom." As they reached the back room, Hawk took a deep breath before pushing the door open. Inside, the dim light revealed a woman, her body slumped against the wall, her eyes closed. She looked weak, barely conscious, but alive. Hawk rushed to her side, his hands gently brushing the hair away from her face. "Ma'am," he called softly, his voice calm. Slowly, the woman's eyes fluttered open, and she blinked, as if trying to focus on the person in front of her. When her eyes locked onto Hawk's, there was a flicker of recognition, then relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice raspy. Hawk nodded. "We're getting you out of here. You're safe now." Behind him, the little girl stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman's gaze turned to her daughter, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The little girl ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her. "I'm so glad you're okay," the girl said, her voice shaky. "I was so scared." The woman pulled her daughter close, hugging her tightly. Hawk stood back, watching the reunion unfold before him. He knew there was still more to do. The stepfather and the stranger were still out there, and there was no way Hawk would let them get away with this. But for now, he allowed the family to have this moment. The Iron Riders had done what they came to do. They had brought this mother and daughter back together. And in the process, they had taken a step toward righting a wrong that had gone on for far too long. The room was heavy with silence after the emotional reunion between the mother and daughter. Hawk stood in the doorway, watching as the little girl clung to her mother, tears streaming down her face. It was a moment of relief, a brief escape from the chaos that had consumed their lives for so long. Hawk knew that this was just one chapter of a much bigger story, but for now, this family had a chance to heal. He turned to his team. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice low but firm. The bikers nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. They had come here for one reason, and that reason wasn't over. The stepfather and the stranger were still out there, and Hawk wasn't about to let them walk away unscathed. The group moved quickly, securing the area around the cabin. The stepfather was a cop, someone who knew the system and how to play it, and the stranger was a loose cannon, a wild card with no regard for the rules. Hawk's mind raced as he thought about their next move. "Bear, take the Back, he ordered. Vince, check the perimeter. The bikers dispersed, leaving Hawk standing in the room with the mother and daughter. He wanted to give them space, but he knew there was more to be done. We're going to make sure you're safe, Hawk said to the woman, his voice soft but steady. No one is going to hurt you or your daughter again. The woman nodded, her eyes tired but grateful. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk gave her a reassuring smile. You don't have to, he replied. We're just doing what we should have done a long time ago. As Hawk turned to leave the room, a sudden crash from outside caught his attention. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, and the bikers quickly gathered around him. Hawk motioned for them to stay back, his eyes narrowing as he listened for any further sounds. What the hell was that? Bear's voice crackled through the radio. Hawk held up a hand. Stay quiet. Another crash, followed by the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. Hawk's grip tightened around his gun. The stepfather and the stranger were not done. They had to be. This wasn't over yet. Get ready, Hawk said, his voice low and commanding. The bikers readied themselves for whatever was coming their way. As the seconds stretched into minutes, Hawk's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that every move they made was being tracked. The silence was broken again by the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Hawk motioned for his team to move out. They were going to find these men, and they weren't leaving until they had answers. Stay close, Hawk muttered, stepping cautiously toward the door. The bikers followed in tight formation, their eyes scanning the woods, their senses on high alert. The air was thick with tension as they approached the edge of the clearing. Hawk's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. The footsteps grew louder, and Hawk's hand tightened on his weapon. He was ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the stepfather, his face twisted in anger, his hand clutching a gun. You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine? He shouted, his voice shaking with rage. Hawk's eyes narrowed. You're not going to get away with this, he said, his voice cold and unwavering. The stepfather took a step forward, his gun raised. You don't understand, he sneered. This is bigger than you. You're just a bunch of bikers. Hawk's eyes flicked to the stranger who stood behind the stepfather, a smirk on his face. This was the moment. Hawk didn't hesitate. With one swift motion, he raised his weapon and aimed it at the stepfather. You're done, Hawk said, his voice low and deadly. The stepfather froze, his eyes widening in fear. He dropped the gun to the ground, the clatter of metal against wood echoing in the silence. Hawk's eyes never left him as he moved forward, his footsteps steady and deliberate. You're going to pay for what you did, Hawk said, his voice a quiet promise. The stranger behind the stepfather stepped forward, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. You think you can stop me, he said, his voice dripping with malice. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Hawk's eyes narrowed. This man was dangerous, and Hawk wasn't going to let him get away either. We'll see about that, he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Without warning, the stranger lunged at Hawk, but Hawk was faster. In one fluid motion, he ducked under the man's arm and twisted his body, sending the stranger crashing to the ground. The stranger struggled, but Hawk had him pinned. You're not going anywhere, Hawk growled. The rest of the bikers moved in, quickly restraining the stepfather. They had both men under control now, and Hawk wasn't about to let them escape again. This ends now, Hawk said, his voice final. The stranger glared at him, his face contorted in fury, but Hawk knew they had won. It was over. The bikers had done what they came to do, and in the process, they had taken down two men who had caused nothing but pain. Hawk turned to the little girl and her mother. You're safe now, he said, his voice softening. The mother nodded, tears filling her eyes. I don't know how to thank you, she whispered. Hawk smiled gently. Just take care of each other, he said, before turning to leave the cabin. The job was done. The Iron Riders had saved the day. The morning light began to filter through the trees. As the Iron Riders stood over the two men they had just subdued, the stepfather and the stranger, once so full of threats and malice, now lay on the ground, handcuffed and utterly defeated. Hawk's heart still raced from the confrontation, but the battle was over. They had won, but there was something deeper gnawing at him. The mission wasn't truly finished until those two men faced the consequences of their actions. Hawk turned his gaze to the little girl and her mother, still inside the cabin. The woman, who had been so fragile just hours ago, now sat by the fire with her daughter curled up beside her. The pair was safe. Hawk's thoughts were interrupted as Bear approached, his giant figure casting a long shadow over Hawk's thoughts. "What's next?" Bear asked, his voice low but calm. Hawk nodded toward the two men they had restrained. "We get them out of here and into the hands of someone who can make sure they pay for what they've done," Hawk replied. Bear glanced at the cabin. "What about them?" "They'll be okay," Hawk said. "They just need time. Time and space." Bear nodded and walked away to gather the other bikers. Hawk took a deep breath, walking to the cabin to speak with the woman one last time. As he entered, he saw her rocking gently, whispering to her daughter, who seemed to have finally drifted off to sleep. The relief on the woman's face was unmistakable, though she still seemed lost in her thoughts. Hawk approached carefully, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace they had found. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes weary but grateful. "I'm okay now. I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "You don't have to thank me," Hawk replied, his tone reassuring. "We did what anyone should do." The woman smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that no words could truly fix. I didn't think anyone would ever help. I didn't think anyone cared enough." Hawk's heart softened. He had heard that sentiment before, and it always stung. People like her, like the little girl, often felt abandoned, like no one was there to hear their cries for help. "We're here now," Hawk said, kneeling beside her. "And we'll make sure you're safe." As they spoke, the little girl stirred in her sleep, her hand clutching her mother's arm. Hawk could see the bond between them, a love that had survived even the darkest of times. "What happens now?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hawk stood up and glanced at the rest of the bikers, who were preparing to leave the area. "We'll take care of everything," he assured her. "You don't need to worry about anything. We'll make sure they face justice." As he walked back outside, he saw the rest of the crew gathering around the two men. The stepfather, still groggy from the knockout punch, looked up at Hawk, his face twisted with hate. The stranger had regained some composure but remained silent, his eyes never leaving Hawk. "You're not going anywhere," Hawk said to the stepfather, his voice cold. The man sneered but said nothing. The stranger looked up at Hawk with an eerie calmness, as if he knew something Hawk didn't. "You've made a mistake," the stranger finally spoke, his voice almost pleasant. "You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." Hawk's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," Hawk said, his voice full of quiet menace. "You're both going to pay for what you've done." "You think you can just take us in?" the stranger asked, laughing bitterly. "The law won't protect you when this is over." Hawk didn't flinch. "You'll be in no position to threaten anyone when I'm through with you." Bear stepped forward and grabbed the stepfather by the collar, lifting him off the ground with one hand. "You'll be singing a different tune when you're in custody," Bear said, his voice booming. Hawk motioned to the rest of the bikers, and they began loading the two men into the back of the truck. They had a long ride ahead of them, but there was no turning back now. As the bikers revved their engines, Hawk took one last look at the cabin, at the woman and her daughter, now standing together in the doorway. The little girl waved as they drove away, a small, hopeful smile on her face. Hawk gave a small nod in return. They had made it through the storm. The road ahead would be long, but it was a road of healing. The bikers drove in silence for the first few miles, the weight of the night's events heavy on all their shoulders. Hawk kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind wandered back to the woman and her daughter. He hoped they would be okay, that they could finally begin to heal after everything they had endured. As the sun began to rise, casting the first light of the new day over the horizon, Hawk felt a small sense of peace settle in his chest. They had done the right thing. They had saved a family from destruction. And that, for all the darkness that had passed, was worth everything. The road stretched ahead as the iron riders made their way out of the woods, the early morning sun casting a soft glow over the horizon. The bikers were quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Hawk led the way, his mind still reeling from the events of the past few hours. He glanced in his rearview mirror, catching sight of the truck carrying the stepfather and the stranger. They were on their way to the nearest town, where the authorities would take over. Hawk didn't trust the system to do what was right, but for now, it was the only option they had. As the convoy drove on, Hawk's thoughts kept drifting back to the little girl and her mother. They had been through hell, and it was far from over. They had been given a chance to start fresh, but the scars would take time to heal. Hawk knew that. He just hoped they would have the strength to get through it. The journey to the town was long, the road winding through forests and open fields. The sound of the motorcycles humming in unison was a comforting rhythm, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The stepfather and the stranger might be captured, but Hawk wasn't convinced they were the only ones involved in whatever dark business had led to the attack on the mother and child. Hawk's gut told him there was more to uncover. As they neared the town, Hawk signaled for the group to slow down. They were almost there. "We'll make a quick stop at the diner," he said into his radio. "Get some food, then head to the sheriff's office to drop these two off." The bikers nodded, their engines quieting. As they entered the town, the small, sleepy town of Riverton seemed almost too quiet for the chaos that had just unfolded. As they pulled into the diner, the bikers dismounted, stretching their legs after the long ride. The little girl and her mother were already waiting at a table by the window. The mother smiled weakly as Hawk walked in, but there was still a sadness in her eyes. The little girl, her face a mixture of exhaustion and hope, looked up at Hawk. "Thank you for saving us," she said softly. Hawk nodded, his eyes softening. "It was our honor," he said. The bikers filed in, taking their seats around the diner. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, a welcome break from the tension of the past few hours. Hawk sat down next to the mother and daughter, his mind still spinning. The mother looked at him with gratitude, but also with a heavy weight of sorrow. "I don't know how to begin to repay you," she said quietly. "We didn't do this for repayment," Hawk said, his voice steady. "You don't owe us anything. But you need to take care of yourselves now. That's what matters." The woman nodded, but Hawk could see the burden in her eyes. It wasn't just the fear of what they had been through. It was the uncertainty of what came next. The stranger and the stepfather might be out of the picture for now, but Hawk knew that their problems were far from over. The mother had to rebuild her life, and the little girl had to find a way to move forward. Hawk wanted to believe that this would be the end of it, but he knew better. "What happens now?" the mother asked, her voice full of doubt. "You take it one day at a time," Hawk said, his tone reassuring. "You start fresh, and if anyone ever threatens you again, you know where to find us." The little girl looked at him, her eyes wide with gratitude. "Will you come visit us?" she asked softly. Hawk smiled, his heart warming at the simple question. "Of course we will," he said. "You're family now." As the bikers finished their breakfast, Hawk's thoughts turned back to the road ahead. The stranger and the stepfather might have been captured, but there were still loose ends to tie up. Hawk's gut told him that this wasn't the last time they'd hear from those men. As they finished their meal, Hawk paid the bill and stood up, motioning for the group to follow. It was time to leave Riverton behind, but the memory of the little girl's face and her mother's quiet strength would stay with him. They'd done the right thing, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that their work was far from over. The Iron Riders were more than just a group of bikers. They were a family, bound together by loyalty, honor, and the promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As they mounted their bikes and revved their engines, Hawk knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. But they were ready. They always were. The Iron Riders were a force to be reckoned with, and nothing would ever stand in their way again. The Iron Riders had barely left the small town of Riverton before Hawk's mind returned to the situation at hand. The stepfather and the stranger were out of the picture for now, but Hawk knew that in their world, danger rarely stayed down for long. It was only a matter of time before the pieces started to fall into place, and Hawk's gut was telling him that this wasn't the end. The road stretched out before them as they made their way down the highway, the wind whipping through their hair and the sound of the engines vibrating in their chests. The ride was quiet, but each rider knew that they were waiting for something that Hawk couldn't quite put his finger on. His thoughts returned to the little girl and her mother. They had been through hell, and Hawk hoped that the quiet moment they now had would give them the peace they deserved. But deep down, he feared that peace would be short-lived. They were still a long way from safe. As the convoy moved down the highway, Hawk signaled for them to stop at a small roadside rest area. It wasn't much, just a small picnic bench and a few trees for shade, but it was enough to stretch their legs and regroup. The bikers dismounted, each one checking their gear and making small talk, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. He walked over to the little girl and her mother, who had stayed close to the truck. The mother looked tired but grateful, and the little girl's eyes still held a quiet sadness that Hawk knew would take time to heal. Are you both doing okay? Hawk asked, his voice soft. The mother smiled faintly, but there was still a weight in her eyes. We're okay. We've been through a lot, but we're alive. And that's more than I thought we'd have. Hawk nodded, but his mind was already back on the road. He could feel something coming, something that would change everything. We'll make sure you're safe, he said, more to reassure himself than her. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. Are you going to stay with us? She asked, her voice small. Hawk crouched down to her level, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. We'll be around, he said, his tone reassuring but firm. But for now, you and your mom need some time to get back to normal. The little girl nodded, though she still looked unsure. I don't know how to go back to normal, she said softly. Hawk felt a pang of sadness. He had heard this too many times before. Children who had lived through trauma didn't just bounce back. It took time. It took healing. You don't have to figure it all out today, Hawk said gently. Take it one step at a time. That's all anyone can do. The mother nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. Hawk stood up, giving them both a small, encouraging smile. I'll be back soon, he said, before turning toward the rest of the group. As he walked back to the others, Hawk's mind remained on the little girl. He couldn't help but feel that there was more to her story than he knew. She had seen things no child should ever have to witness. And Hawk wasn't sure if she would ever truly be able to forget what had happened. He glanced back at the mother and daughter, watching as they sat together on the bench. The silence between them spoke volumes. The mother was trying to comfort her daughter, but Hawk knew it would take time for them to both truly feel safe. As the bikers gathered around their bikes, Hawk couldn't ignore the feeling that something was closing in. It was as though the calm before the storm was stretching out, and he knew that the storm was coming. He turned to Bear, who was checking the bikes. Keep your eyes open, Hawk said, his voice low. Something doesn't feel right. Bear looked up at him, his eyes narrowing. You think we're being followed? He asked. Hawk didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure, but his instincts were telling him that there was something more to this than just a simple rescue mission. I don't know yet, Hawk said finally, but we'll find out soon enough. The group mounted their bikes, revving their engines and preparing to continue the ride. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Hawk kept his gaze focused ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the stepfather and the stranger. There were others involved in whatever twisted plan they had set into motion. The riders moved forward, their bikes cutting through the quiet countryside. Hawk kept his senses sharp, listening for any sign of trouble. They had to make it to the next town. They had to make sure that the little girl and her mother were safe. And Hawk wasn't going to stop until that was done. The Iron Riders had barely left the small town of Riverton before Hawk's mind returned to the situation at hand. The stepfather and the stranger were out of the picture for now, but Hawk knew that in their world, danger rarely stayed down for long. It was only a matter of time before the pieces started to fall into place, and Hawk's gut was telling him that this wasn't the end. The road stretched out before them as they made their way down the highway, the wind whipping through their hair and the sound of the engines vibrating in their chests. The ride was quiet, but each rider knew that they were waiting for something that Hawk couldn't quite put his finger on. His thoughts returned to the little girl and her mother. They had been through hell, and Hawk hoped that the quiet moment they now had would give them the peace they deserved. But deep down, he feared that peace would be short-lived. They were still a long way from safe. As the convoy moved down the highway, Hawk signaled for them to stop. At a small roadside rest area. It wasn't much, just a small picnic bench and a few trees for shade, but it was enough to stretch their legs and regroup. The bikers dismounted, each one checking their gear and making small talk, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. He walked over to the little girl and her mother, who had stayed close to the truck. The mother looked tired but grateful, and the little girl's eyes still held a quiet sadness that Hawk knew would take time to heal. Are you both doing okay? Hawk asked, his voice soft. The mother smiled faintly, but there was still a weight in her eyes. We're okay. We've been through a lot, but we're alive. And that's more than I thought we'd have. Hawk nodded, but his mind was already back on the road. He could feel something coming, something that would change everything. We'll make sure you're safe, he said, more to reassure himself than her. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "Are you going to stay with us?" she asked, her voice small. Hawk crouched down to her level, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "We'll be around," he said, his tone reassuring but firm. "But for now, you and your mom need some time to get back to normal." The little girl nodded, though she still looked unsure. "I don't know how to go back to normal," she said softly. Hawk felt a pang of sadness. He had heard this too many times before. Children who had lived through trauma didn't just bounce back. It took time. It took healing. "You don't have to figure it all out today," Hawk said gently. "Take it one step at a time. That's all anyone can do." The mother nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. Hawk stood up, giving them both a small, encouraging smile. "I'll be back soon," he said, before turning toward the rest of the group. As he walked back to the others, Hawk's mind remained on the little girl. He couldn't help but feel that there was more to her story than he knew. She had seen things no child should ever have to witness. And Hawk wasn't sure if she would ever truly be able to forget what had happened. He glanced back at the mother and daughter, watching as they sat together on the bench. The silence between them spoke volumes. The mother was trying to comfort her daughter, but Hawk knew it would take time for them to both truly feel safe. As the bikers gathered around their bikes, Hawk couldn't ignore the feeling that something was closing in. It was as though the calm before the storm was stretching out, and he knew that the storm was coming. He turned to Bear, who was checking the bikes. "Keep your eyes open," Hawk said, his voice low. "Something doesn't feel right." Bear looked up at him, his eyes narrowing. "You think we're being followed?" he asked. Hawk didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure, but his instincts were telling him that there was something more to this than just a simple rescue mission. "I don't know yet," Hawk said finally, "but we'll find out soon enough." The group mounted their bikes, revving their engines and preparing to continue the ride. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Hawk kept his gaze focused ahead, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the stepfather and the stranger. There were others involved in whatever twisted plan they had set into motion. The riders moved forward, their bikes cutting through the quiet countryside. Hawk kept his senses sharp, listening for any sign of trouble. They had to make it to the next town. They had to make sure that the little girl and her mother were safe. And Hawk wasn't going to stop until that was done. The Iron Riders were now deep into enemy territory, the engine roars of their bikes echoing through the streets of Riverside. Hawk's mind raced as they sped toward the warehouse district. The situation had escalated quickly. What started as a simple rescue mission had turned into a full-blown retaliation. The Serpents, the gang that had once been allies, had now become enemies, and they had crossed a line that Hawk could never forgive. The stakes had risen, and Hawk was determined to finish what they had started. The streets blurred as they raced through the city, their formation tight, with Bear leading the way, Diesel and Clutch flanking the rear. Hawk stayed in the center, focused, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The sun had begun to set, the last traces of daylight fading into the horizon. They were getting closer. Hawk's thoughts kept returning to the phone call he had received earlier from Rick. The truth had hit him like a punch to the gut. Rick's son, Jamal, had been taken as part of the Serpents' retaliation. It was personal now. This wasn't just about old club politics. It was about family, loyalty, and the promise he had made to Rick years ago. As they approached the warehouse district, Hawk's instincts were on high alert. The area was dark, the streets lined with empty buildings and abandoned factories. It was the perfect place for a showdown. The Iron Riders had to be careful. One wrong move could send this entire operation into chaos. "We're almost there," Bear's voice crackled through the radio. "Keep sharp." Hawk nodded, his grip tightening on the handlebars. They couldn't afford to slip up now. They had to find Jamal and get him out of there before things got even worse. As they reached the edge of the district, Hawk spotted a pair of headlights up ahead. The silver Suburban. It was parked outside one of the old warehouses, the same one they had been tailing earlier. The Serpents were already here. "This is it," Hawk said, his voice low. "Everyone, hold position." The bikers slowed, their engines purring as they came to a stop behind a row of dumpsters, staying out of sight. Hawk's heart pounded in his chest. They were so close, yet the danger was palpable. They had to make their move quickly. "Clutch, you're up," Hawk said, his eyes fixed on the warehouse. "Cut the power to the building. We don't want anyone inside to have a chance to react." Clutch gave a quick nod before peeling off from the group, disappearing into the shadows. Hawk turned to Diesel and Bear. "You two, follow me. The rest of you keep watch." With that, they dismounted, their boots hitting the ground silently as they moved toward the building. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal doors reflecting the dim light from the street lamps. Hawk motioned for Bear to take the right side, while he and Diesel circled around to the left. The tension was thick as they moved closer, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. As they reached the back door of the warehouse, Hawk heard a faint noise, footsteps. He motioned for Diesel to stop, and they waited, holding their breath. The seconds felt like hours. Then, the door creaked open. One of the serpents stepped out, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. Hawk's hand instinctively went to his weapon, but he held back. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. They needed to get inside without alerting anyone. Hawk gave the signal, and they moved in, sneaking through the door and into the building. The air inside was stale, the scent of dust and decay thick in the air. Hawk's heart beat faster as they crept through the dark corridors, their footsteps muffled by the old floorboards. They needed to find Jamal, and fast. As they turned a corner, they saw him. The boy was tied to a chair in the center of the room, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes wide with fear. Hawk's blood ran cold. "Jamal," he whispered, his voice tight with anger. The boy's eyes flickered toward them, recognition flashing across his face. "Uncle Forge," he whispered hoarsely. Hawk's heart ached at the sight of the boy, so small and vulnerable. He moved quickly, his hand working to untie the ropes that bound Jamal to the chair. Diesel stood watch, his eyes constantly scanning the room. "We need to get him out of here," Hawk said, his voice low but urgent. Now, as Hawk helped Jamal to his feet, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the room. The door slammed open, and the serpents stormed in. "You thought you could just take him?" One of them sneered, pulling a gun from his waistband. Hawk stepped in front of Jamal, his body blocking the boy from view. "Not today," Hawk said, his voice cold and deadly. Bear and Diesel moved to flank Hawk, their eyes locked on the serpents, ready for a fight. The tension in the room was thick, and Hawk knew that if things went south, they wouldn't be able to back down. "You're outnumbered," Hawk said, his voice steady. "You don't want to do this." The serpents didn't hesitate. They raised their weapons, but Hawk's crew was faster. A blur of motion, and the room erupted in chaos. The bikers moved like a well-oiled machine, subduing the serpents with brutal precision. Within seconds, the room was silent again, the only sound the heavy breathing of the Iron Riders. "Get him out of here," Hawk said, his voice calm but commanding. Bear helped Jamal to his feet, guiding him toward the exit. "We're not leaving without you," Hawk said, turning to Diesel. The two bikers shared a brief look before nodding in agreement. The Iron Riders had done what they came to do. They had protected their own, no matter the cost. As they made their way back to their bikes, Hawk felt a sense of relief wash over him. They had kept their promise to Rick, and now, it was time to get Jamal to safety. But Hawk knew this was far from over. The serpents had sent a clear message, and Hawk wasn't about to let them get away with it. This fight was only beginning. The roar of the engines died down as the Iron Riders made their way out of the warehouse district. Hawk, his mind racing with adrenaline and the weight of the mission, glanced over at Jamal, who was riding with Bear on the back of his bike. The boy was shaken, but the look in his eyes had changed. There was a flicker of hope there, and Hawk wasn't about to let that flame go out. As they left the industrial area behind, the familiar feeling of the open road stretched out ahead of them. The wind whipped past, but Hawk couldn't shake the unease that had settled in his gut. They had rescued Jamal, but the fight wasn't over. Hawk could feel it. There was something bigger at play here, something that would come back to haunt them. The serpents weren't just a street gang. They were a force to be reckoned with. And this time, they had made it personal. As the bikers cruised along the highway, Hawk's thoughts drifted back to the moment in the warehouse, to the look on the stepfather's face as they took Jamal from him. Hawk had seen that look before, defeat. But the serpents weren't the kind of group to take defeat lying down. Hawk knew that they would come after him, after the Iron Riders, with everything they had. He had made a promise to Rick, and he would keep it, but the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. They still had a long way to go before Jamal and his family were safe. The convoy slowed as they approached a gas station on the outskirts of town. Hawk signaled for the group to stop. He needed a moment to think, to plan. The Iron Riders dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a thud as they stretched their legs. Hawk walked over to Bear and Diesel, who were standing by their bikes. "What's our next move?" Bear asked, his voice steady. Hawk looked out across the desert horizon, the sun dipping low behind the mountains. "We take Jamal back to his mom," Hawk said, his voice firm. "But I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Diesel nodded, his expression grim. "The serpents are going to retaliate. They'll come after us." Hawk didn't respond immediately. His mind was still racing, but he knew Diesel was right. The gang wouldn't just let this go. "We can't stay here," Hawk said finally. "We need to get back to the clubhouse and regroup. We'll need backup." The bikers moved quickly, mounting their bikes and revving the engines as they got back on the road. The wind kicked up dust as they made their way through the deserted highway, the only sound the roar of their engines and the occasional radio crackling with static. As they rode, Hawk's mind drifted back to Rick, to the promise he had made all those years ago. It was a promise he had kept, but he knew there was more to do. Jamal's life was still hanging in the balance, and the serpents weren't done yet. The Iron Riders would need to be ready for whatever came next. Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar sound, the screech of tires ahead. His instincts kicked in, and he slammed on the brakes, bringing his bike to a halt just as a silver SUV came barreling down the road, swerving to avoid the bikers. Hawk's heart skipped a beat. It was them. The serpents had found them. Without a word, Hawk signaled to Bear and Diesel, and the three of them peeled off, riding in perfect formation as they gave chase. The SUV was speeding ahead, its tires squealing as it tried to outrun the bikers. Hawk's blood boiled. The serpents were not going to get away this time. "Stay on them," Hawk barked into his radio. "We're not letting them get away." The bikes roared as they gained on the SUV, closing the gap. With each passing second, Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars as he leaned into the curve, his bike skimming the edge of the pavement. The SUV was just ahead now, its taillights flashing in the fading light of the day. Hawk's eyes were locked on the vehicle, and he knew what he had to do. He signaled to Bear, and the two of them moved in, cutting off the SUV's path. The driver of the SUV slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The Iron Riders were already on top of them. Hawk and Bear moved in, their bikes coming to a stop just inches from the SUV. The driver, a man with a cold, calculating look in his eyes, slammed the door open, but before he could make a move, Hawk was on him. With one swift motion, Hawk grabbed the man by the collar, yanking him from the vehicle and throwing him to the ground. "You're not going anywhere," Hawk growled, his voice filled with fury. The man struggled, but Hawk's grip was like iron. "Where's your backup?" Hawk demanded, his voice deadly. The man didn't respond, but Hawk could see the fear in his eyes. It was only a matter of time before the rest of the serpents showed up. "Tell me where they are," Hawk pressed, his grip tightening. Finally, the man spoke, his voice hoarse with fear. "They're coming. They'll be here soon." Hawk didn't waste any time. He punched the man in the face, knocking him out cold. "Take him back to the clubhouse," Hawk ordered Bear, who nodded and began dragging the man toward their bikes. "We'll finish this back home." As Hawk mounted his bike and revved the engine, he knew that the battle wasn't over. The serpents were out there, and they would come after him with everything they had. But the Iron Riders were ready. They always had been. And this time, they would make sure the serpents learned that messing with their family came at a cost. The air was thick with tension as the Iron Riders returned to their clubhouse, the engines of their bikes still echoing through the night. Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars as he led the way, his mind still processing the events of the past few hours. They had rescued Jamal, confronted the serpents, and made it out alive, but the job wasn't finished yet. The promise he had made to Rick was still hanging over him. He hadn't forgotten the look in Jamal's eyes, the fear, the confusion. That boy had seen things no child should ever have to witness. And Hawk was determined to make sure nothing like that ever happened again. As they reached the gates of the clubhouse, Hawk signaled for the group to stop. They had to regroup, to plan their next move. The Iron Riders dismounted, their boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. Hawk glanced over at Bear, who was helping Jamal off the back of his bike. The boy was still shaken, but he was alive. And that was all that mattered. "Get him inside," Hawk said to Bear. "We need to talk." The group filed into the clubhouse, the familiar smell of leather and coffee mixing in the air. Hawk's thoughts were still on the serpents. The silver SUV, the men who had taken Jamal. There was no way they would just let this go. And now, with Rick's past catching up to him, things were bound to get worse before they got better. Hawk couldn't afford to waste any time. "We'll set up watch," he said to Diesel and Clutch, who were standing nearby. "We need eyes on every corner of this place. The serpents are going to come for us. We can't let our guard down." Diesel nodded, his eyes already scanning the perimeter. "Got it, boss." Clutch stood silently, his jaw clenched tight. Hawk turned to Bear, who was sitting next to Jamal. The boy's eyes were hollow, his face pale. He hadn't said much since they had left the warehouse, but Hawk knew he was still processing everything. "How's he holding up?" Hawk asked. Bear looked at the boy, his expression softening. "He's tough, but he's going to need time." Hawk nodded, his heart heavy. They had done everything they could to protect him, but the scars of what he'd been through would take longer to heal. As the bikers gathered around, Hawk stood in the center of the room, his mind racing through the possibilities. The serpents had crossed a line, and Hawk knew there was no turning back now. They would come after him, after the Iron Riders, with everything they had. And when that happened, they had to be ready. "We're not just protecting Jamal anymore," Hawk said, his voice firm. "We're protecting everyone who's ever trusted us. This is bigger than just one fight. This is about taking a stand." The room was quiet as the bikers absorbed his words. They had been through hell together, and they had always come out on top. But Hawk knew this time would be different. The serpents were dangerous, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. "We need to make sure they know they're not going to win this," Hawk continued. "We've fought for this family before, and we'll do it again." The bikers nodded in agreement, their resolve strengthening. They weren't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As the night wore on, the tension in the clubhouse grew. Hawk's mind kept returning to Rick and his family. They had helped him once, back when things had seemed impossible. Now, it was time to return the favor. Hawk didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The Iron Riders were in this together. They always had been, and they always would be. "Get some rest," Hawk said as the group began to disperse. "We ride at first light." The bikers nodded and made their way to their rooms, but Hawk remained standing in the center of the room. His mind was still racing, his thoughts consumed with what was to come. The serpents wouldn't stop. They would push, they would test, they would try to break them. But Hawk knew the Iron Riders would never be broken. They were a family, and nothing was more powerful than a family that stood together. As the clock ticked on, Hawk finally made his way to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He had made a promise to Rick, and he would keep it, no matter the cost. "We're ready for whatever comes next," Hawk whispered to himself, his voice filled with determination. The battle wasn't over yet, but the Iron Riders were prepared, and they would do whatever it took to protect those who needed them the most.